I knew the HOA was bad news, but I never expected them to break into my property and rip my security cameras right off my house. I pulled into my driveway that evening, exhausted from a long day at work, only to notice something was off. My front porch felt exposed. I looked up at the corner where my security camera should have been. Gone. My stomach dropped. I rushed around to check the others. Every single one had been removed. That's when I saw the note taped to my front door, written in the all-too-familiar, passive-aggressive handwriting of Gretchen Turner, the HOA president. Dear Mr. Nolan Brooks, your security cameras have been removed due to multiple privacy complaints from your neighbors. Please refrain from installing them again as they violate HOA guidelines. Failure to comply will result in fines. Thank you for your cooperation. I clenched my jaw. Privacy complaints? This was my house. My property. My cameras were angled at my own yard and driveway, and I had installed them for security, not to spy on my neighbors. I stormed inside, grabbed my laptop, and pulled up the footage from the cloud storage. If they thought they could just waltz onto my property and do whatever they wanted, they were in for a rude awakening. As I reviewed the footage, my anger boiled over. There they were, Gretchen and two of her lackeys, Harold and Lisa, all dressed in their HOA committee uniforms like they were on some official mission. The video showed them walking up my driveway in broad daylight with a ladder and toolboxes. They climbed up, unscrewed my cameras from the walls, and carried them off like they had every right to do so. That was breaking and entering. That was theft. That was illegal. And I wasn't about to let it slide. I dug into the HOA bylaws, my city's property laws, and everything I could find on the legality of security cameras. Nowhere did it say I couldn't have them. In fact, state law specifically allowed homeowners to install security cameras on their own property. I was already drafting an official complaint when my phone buzzed. An email from the HOA. Mandatory HOA meeting, attendance required. Confidential matters to discuss. Oh, I was attending all right. And they had no idea that I was about to turn their little meeting into a nightmare. I arrived at the HOA meeting early. The community center was already filling up, mostly with the usual crowd, homeowners who either tolerated the HOA's nonsense or were too afraid to challenge them. A few wary glances were thrown my way, but I ignored them. I had bigger things to focus on. The meeting room itself was an unimpressive space, fluorescent lighting, faded chairs, and a long table at the front where the board members sat like a self-appointed royal court. Gretchen was in the center, flanked by Harold and Lisa, the same two who had helped her trespass onto my property. She didn't even look at me as she shuffled some papers, pretending to be busy. I took a seat near the back, setting my phone on the table in front of me. What Gretchen and her cronies didn't know was that I wasn't just here to argue, I was here to record. I had done my research, and in this state, as long as I was part of the conversation, I could legally record the meeting without telling anyone. People murmured as the meeting officially started. Gretchen cleared her throat and launched into her usual spiel: budget reports, upcoming community events, and a long-winded rant about how residents needed to be more mindful of their landscaping choices. I let her drone on, waiting for my moment. Then, finally, she got to the real reason I was here. She clasped her hands together, scanning the room with an air of fake concern. Now, there's an important issue we need to address. A certain homeowner, she didn't even try to hide that she meant me, has been violating community privacy guidelines by installing multiple surveillance cameras on their home. A few people murmured, but no one dared to speak up. Gretchen continued, "These cameras have made several residents uncomfortable, and after careful consideration, the HOA took action to remove them for the sake of the community." That was my cue. I stood up. "You mean you trespassed on my property and stole my cameras?" The room went silent. Gretchen's expression barely flickered, but I saw the tension in her shoulders. "Mr. Brooks, we acted within our authority." "No, you didn't," I cut in. "I have proof that you and two other board members entered my property without permission. You removed my legally installed security cameras, which, by the way, is theft. And I have it all on video." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Gretchen's face paled, but she forced a smile. "Mr. Brooks, let's not escalate this." The HOA was simply responding to resident complaints. I pulled out my laptop, connecting it to the projector before she could stop me. The screen lit up with the footage of Gretchen, Harold, and Lisa marching up my driveway with tools in hand. Then, clear as day, they could be seen climbing up, unscrewing my cameras and walking off with them. The room erupted. Someone in the front row turned to Gretchen. "You broke into his property? This is outrageous," another homeowner muttered. Gretchen's carefully maintained composure was slipping. "This is being taken out of context," she snapped. "We were enforcing community rules." I folded my arms. "Show me where in the HOA bylaws it says you can break into someone's property and steal their belongings." She opened her mouth, then shut it again. I wasn't done. "Not only was this illegal, but you also failed to provide any notice, which even the HOA rules require. You sent me a letter after taking my property, not before. That's not how enforcement works. That's how criminals operate." Lisa, who had been silent until now, leaned in and whispered something to Gretchen. I could see the panic in her eyes. They hadn't expected me to come prepared. I turned to the rest of the homeowners. "This is the kind of leadership we have, one that thinks they can do whatever they want, whenever they want, with no consequences." Murmurs turned into outright discussion. People were angry. And it wasn't just about my cameras, this was about all the nonsense the HOA had been pulling for years. Fines for ridiculous infractions, arbitrary rule changes, sudden increases in fees. My case was just the final straw. Gretchen tried to regain control. "All right, that's enough," she said, her voice strained. "Mr. Brooks, if you have an issue, you can file a formal complaint through the proper channels." I smiled. "Oh, I already have." "With the police." Her eyes widened. I let the words settle before continuing. "Trespassing, theft, property damage. I filed a report and given them the footage. So, Gretchen, Lisa, Harold, I'd suggest getting a good lawyer." The room exploded once more, but this time, Gretchen had nothing to say. She just sat there, gripping the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Harold, who had spent most of the meeting looking smug, suddenly seemed very interested in his lap. Lisa, usually the most outspoken of the three, looked like she wanted to disappear. I gathered my things, giving the room one last glance. This HOA has been running unchecked for too long. That changes tonight. I walked out, leaving them to deal with the mess they had created. And something told me this was far from over. The fallout from the HOA meeting spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next morning, residents were buzzing about Gretchen and her team's blatant abuse of power. It wasn't just the people who had attended the meeting. Word traveled fast, and suddenly homeowners who had been too intimidated to speak up before were finding their voices. I barely made it out of my driveway before my neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, waved me down. She was in her 70s, sharp as ever, and had lived here longer than anyone. She wasn't one to get involved in HOA drama, but this morning she looked furious. She leaned against my car window, shaking her head. "Nolan, I heard what happened last night. Those crooks have gone too far this time." I nodded. "They really have." She scoffed. "I always knew Gretchen was power-hungry, but breaking into someone's property? That's a new low." I wasn't surprised she felt that way. Over the years, she had fought off her fair share of ridiculous HOA fines, always managing to outmaneuver them with her sharp wit and knowledge of property laws. If she was angry, then I knew others were too. "What are you planning to do next?" she asked. I glanced at my phone. "The police are handling the trespassing and theft charges. But I'm not stopping there. I'm digging into the HOA's finances. If they're willing to break the law over something as small as security cameras, who knows what else they've been up to?" Mrs. Calloway's eyes lit up. "Now that's a smart move. I've always found their financial reports suspicious. Dues keep going up, but we don't see much improvement in the neighborhood." That was exactly what had been bothering me. The HOA collected hefty fees from homeowners every month. Yet the roads were full of potholes, the community center was falling apart, and the landscaping was barely maintained. Where was all the money going? After thanking Mrs. Calloway, I got back in my car and headed to work. But throughout the day, I kept thinking about the HOA's finances. By the time I got home, I had a plan. That night, I sat down with my laptop and started going through every HOA financial document I could find. They were supposed to be publicly accessible to homeowners, but unsurprisingly, the files were buried under layers of bureaucratic nonsense. After some digging, I found the most recent budget report. The numbers didn't add up. According to the report, a significant portion of the HOA's funds were allocated to community improvements. But when I cross-referenced those projects with what had actually been done in the neighborhood, I found nothing. No major renovations, no new amenities, nothing that justified the amount of money being spent. Then I found something even more damning: several payments made to a contracting company called Turner Property Management. At first glance, it seemed legitimate. But a little research revealed that Turner Property Management was owned by none other than Gretchen's husband. They were funneling HOA money directly into their own pockets. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. This was bigger than I thought. The next morning, I reached out to a few neighbors who I knew had been frustrated with the HOA for years. I showed them the financial discrepancies, and their reactions were immediate outrage. One of them, a retired accountant named Dan, offered to help dig deeper. He had a sharp eye for financial fraud, and within hours, he found even more evidence: falsified invoices, duplicate payments to the same company, and inflated costs for routine maintenance. By the end of the day, we had enough to take them down. That evening, we called an emergency homeowners meeting. This time, we weren't going to let Gretchen control the narrative. When she arrived, she looked uneasy. She must have sensed that the tide was turning. I didn't waste any time. The moment the meeting started, I stood up and projected the financial records onto the screen. "Gretchen," I said, my voice steady, "can you explain why the HOA has been paying thousands of dollars to Turner Property Management, a company owned by your husband?" The room went silent. Gretchen's face turned red. "That's a legitimate business expense," she said quickly. "They provide essential maintenance services." Dan, the accountant, shook his head. "No, they don't. I checked. There are no service records, no permits, nothing. The only thing Turner Property Management has done is collect HOA money." Murmurs of anger spread through the crowd. I pressed on. "And let's not forget the falsified invoices and duplicate payments. This isn't just mismanagement, Gretchen. This is fraud." Lisa and Harold looked panicked. They hadn't signed up for this level of exposure. "I think it's time for a vote," Mrs. Calloway said, standing up. Effective immediately, I motioned to remove Gretchen, Lisa, and Harold from the board. Hands shot up around the room. Gretchen tried to argue, but the homeowners had had enough. One by one, people voiced their grievances: unexplained fines, unfair rule enforcement, missing funds. The vote was unanimous. Gretchen and her cronies were officially out. As security escorted them out of the meeting, Gretchen shot me a glare filled with pure hatred. But she couldn't do anything about it. The power she had clung to for so long was gone. With the corrupt leadership removed, the neighborhood finally had a chance to rebuild. And this time, we would make sure the HOA worked for the homeowners, not against them. With Gretchen and her cronies officially ousted, the real work began. The neighborhood wasn't just angry, they were ready to take action. For years, the HOA had operated unchecked, treating homeowners like subjects instead of residents with rights. Now, with the corrupt leadership gone, it was time to fix the damage they had done. I spent the next few days working with the newly appointed interim HOA board, a group of level-headed homeowners who actually cared about improving the community rather than lining their own pockets. Dan, the retired accountant, took the lead in going through the HOA's financial records with a fine-tooth comb. What he uncovered was even worse than we had initially thought. Turner Property Management wasn't the only fraudulent expense. There were also payments made to bogus consulting firms, suspicious reimbursements to board members, and a slush fund disguised as emergency maintenance costs. The total amount of misused funds went into the tens of thousands. It was outright embezzlement. With this new evidence, we contacted both the police and a homeowner's rights attorney. The former board members weren't just getting removed. They were going to be investigated for financial crimes. Gretchen might have thought she could get away with it, but the paper trail didn't lie. Meanwhile, I had another issue to deal with: getting my security cameras back. The police had already been notified about the trespassing and theft, but Gretchen had refused to return them, claiming they were confiscated for community safety. Since she was no longer in power, her excuses didn't hold any weight. I decided to pay her a visit. Her house was one of the largest in the neighborhood, a testament to how much she had personally benefited from HOA funds. Her manicured lawn and pristine driveway stood in stark contrast to the neglected state of the community she had ruled over. When she opened the door, she didn't bother hiding her disdain. She looked exhausted, her usual air of self-importance cracked under the weight of everything that had happened. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told her I wanted my cameras back. She scoffed, claiming she had no idea where they were. But I wasn't buying it. I reminded her that theft was a criminal offense, and with the police already investigating her for financial fraud, the last thing she needed was another charge added to the list. Her bravado faltered. She disappeared inside for a few minutes, then returned with a cardboard box containing my cameras. Some were damaged, wires cut, lenses scratched. Clearly, she hadn't just taken them, she had tried to make sure I couldn't use them again. I took the box without another word and left. Back home, I tested each camera. 2 were beyond repair, but the others were salvageable. I reinstalled them immediately, making sure they were positioned exactly as they had been before. This time, I added a few extras, hidden in less obvious spots. If anyone tried to remove them again, I'd have them on video before they even got close. With the cameras back in place and the HOA under new management, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift. People were more open, more willing to talk about the issues they had previously been afraid to bring up. Homeowners who had been fined unfairly came forward with their own stories. Some had been forced to pay absurd penalties for minor infractions, mailboxes that weren't the right shade of beige, holiday decorations taken down a few days late, grass that was slightly overgrown. Others had been pressured into unnecessary renovations just to meet arbitrary HOA standards. The new board wasted no time in overturning these ridiculous rules. They started working on a fairer system, one that actually benefited the community instead of policing it. And then the final blow came. The district attorney's office announced that they were officially opening an investigation into the former HOA leadership. Gretchen, Lisa, and Harold were all facing potential charges for financial fraud, misappropriation of funds, and thanks to my footage, criminal trespassing and theft. Gretchen's house, the very symbol of her abuse of power, was suddenly the scene of law enforcement activity. Investigators went in and out, carrying boxes of documents and computer equipment. The neighborhood watched from a distance, whispering among themselves. No one felt sorry for her. By the end of the week, Gretchen was gone. She sold her house in a hurry, likely trying to escape the legal mess she had created. Lisa and Harold followed soon after. Without their positions of power, they had no reason to stay. The HOA, once a tool of control and corruption, became something else entirely. With a new board that actually listened to the homeowners, the neighborhood transformed. Fees were lowered, unnecessary fines were eliminated, and real improvements were finally made. As for me, I kept my cameras up. Not because I expected another HOA power grab, but because I had learned an important lesson: when people think they can get away with something, they will push the limits until they are stopped. And I had made sure that this time they were stopped for good. With the HOA corruption dismantled and Gretchen gone, the neighborhood felt like a different place. No one was walking on eggshells anymore, afraid of arbitrary fines or sudden rule changes. Homeowners who had barely interacted before were now coming together, sharing stories, and finally feeling like they had control over their own homes. But just because Gretchen and her cronies were out didn't mean everything was over. There was still work to be done. The new HOA board, led by homeowners who actually cared about fairness, had a massive task ahead of them. The financial mess left behind was worse than expected. Dan, the retired accountant, was sorting through ledgers that had been deliberately muddled to hide fraud. The money that had been siphoned off over the years meant we were behind on real maintenance projects, and the previous board had left contracts in place that drained funds into useless expenses. One of the most shocking discoveries came when Dan called me over to his house one evening. He had a stack of papers on his kitchen table, eyebrows furrowed in concentration. He pointed to a document. It was a contract between the HOA and Turner Property Management, the sham company run by Gretchen's husband. It wasn't just a basic maintenance agreement, it was a binding contract that extended for another 2 years, with a clause that made it nearly impossible to cancel without paying an outrageous termination fee. Dan exhaled sharply, pushing the papers toward me. They locked us in tight. If we try to cancel, we'd owe them nearly $50,000 in penalties. That number made my stomach turn. Even after being exposed, Gretchen had rigged things to make sure we couldn't easily undo the damage. But I wasn't about to let that stop us. I spent the next few days diving into every legal document I could find. If Gretchen had been shady enough to draft a contract like this, there had to be a way out. I consulted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, and after reviewing the contract, She pointed out a critical detail: Gretchen had signed it without the proper authorization. Under state law, any contract over a certain dollar amount required approval from the entire HOA board. But the signatures on this contract, only Gretchen's and Harold's. Lisa hadn't even been included, likely because they wanted to avoid any chance of dissent. That meant the contract was legally invalid. Armed with this information, we called an emergency HOA meeting to officially nullify the fraudulent agreement. Word spread quickly, and by the time the meeting started, the room was packed. People were done being taken advantage of. Dan presented the findings to the homeowners, carefully explaining how Gretchen had tried to trap us with a contract that never should have been signed. As he spoke, I watched the reactions around the room, faces hardening, some shaking their heads in disbelief. When the time came to vote on terminating the contract and pursuing legal action against Gretchen and her husband, it was unanimous. The contract was voided, and our lawyer would be handling the next steps to recover the stolen funds. That night, as I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but feel a weight lifting. We weren't just cleaning up a corrupt HOA, we were taking back our community. Over the next few weeks, actual improvements started happening. The potholes that had been ignored for years were finally fixed. The neglected community center got a much-needed renovation. Homeowners could decorate their homes however they wanted without fear of ridiculous fines. Even better, the police investigation into Gretchen's financial crimes was moving forward. The district attorney's office had enough evidence to proceed with charges, and while it would take time for the legal process to play out, one thing was clear: Gretchen wasn't walking away from this unscathed. One evening, I was working on reinstalling one of my security cameras when Mrs. Calloway strolled up the sidewalk with a satisfied expression. She watched as I adjusted the camera's angle, nodding approvingly. "You know, Nolan, I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years, and I've never seen the HOA actually work for the people until now." I gave her a knowing look. "It took a lot to get here," she chuckled. "It did, but it was worth it. And I have a feeling Gretchen is realizing that too." She wasn't wrong. Gretchen had gone from ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist to being the subject of community gossip. People shared updates on the case, and while she had disappeared from public view, no one had forgotten what she had done. I turned back to my camera, making sure it was secure. This time, no one was going to take them down. Not that anyone would dare now. The neighborhood was healing, but the damage Gretchen and her board had done ran deep. With the fraudulent contract voided and the investigation into the stolen funds underway, homeowners were finally seeing progress. The roads were being repaired, unnecessary fines had been refunded, and the HOA was no longer a dictatorship. But there was still one final battle to fight: making sure this never happened again. Dan and I had been working with the new HOA board to rewrite the bylaws. The old ones had been deliberately vague, allowing Gretchen to twist them however she wanted. Now, we were making sure homeowners' rights were explicitly protected. No more arbitrary fines, no more unilateral decisions, and most importantly, no more unchecked power. The biggest change was a new rule requiring major decisions to be voted on by the entire community. No more backroom deals or shady contracts signed without oversight. Every homeowner would have a say in how their money was spent. As the final draft of the bylaws was completed, we scheduled a vote. The turnout was overwhelming. People who had never attended an HOA meeting before showed up, eager to make sure history didn't repeat itself. The new bylaws passed with near unanimous approval. With the future of the neighborhood secured, I turned my attention to the last loose end: Gretchen's legal troubles. The district attorney's office had been building their case, and now they were ready to move forward. The evidence Dan and I had uncovered: the fraudulent contracts, the missing funds, the illegal trespassing was more than enough to pursue charges. Gretchen, Harold, and Lisa were facing serious consequences. Then something unexpected happened. Gretchen tried to strike a deal. A lawyer representing her reached out to the new HOA board offering to return a portion of the stolen funds in exchange for dropping any civil lawsuits. It was a desperate move, one that told me she knew she was in real trouble. The board rejected the offer without hesitation. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about accountability. A week later, Gretchen was officially indicted. News spread fast, and soon her pristine house had a for sale sign planted in the front yard. She was leaving, but not on her own terms. The sight of movers carrying out her expensive furniture was strangely satisfying. For years, she had ruled over the neighborhood like a queen, treating homeowners like subjects. Now, she was the one being forced out. As I watched from my front porch, Mrs. Calloway walked up carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one with a knowing expression. Without looking at the chaos unfolding across the street, she took a sip. Karma sure has a way of catching up, doesn't it? I nodded, taking a slow drink. It does. We stood there in silence for a while, watching as Gretchen, defeated and humiliated, climbed into her car and drove away. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it truly belonged to the homeowners. And I knew that as long as people stood up for their rights, no HOA would ever be able to take it away again.